Washington Journal continues.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, joins us this morning. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
You served on the Budget Committee yesterday. We saw Senator Patty Murray, the chairman, introduce her budget plan. Here's the headline in the Washington Times: "There are no sacred cows." It calls for $1 trillion in new taxes. That was the Washington Times takeaway. What's your takeaway?
Well, what it does is also call for substantial cuts, but it deals with deficit reduction in a balanced way. I think, as many viewers know, the Ryan budget and what the Republicans want to do is do deficit reduction simply by cutting. Doing away with Medicare as we know it right now, converting that into a voucher system, which will be very, very onerous for senior citizens, making devastating cuts in Medicaid, which means that millions and millions of American people and kids will lose their health insurance, massive cuts in education, in nutrition, basically every program that in the middle of a terrible recession working people depend upon would be done away with. What my view is, and I think to some degree what the committee is moving toward, is to say, wait a second, we are seeing a middle class collapsing, poverty at a very high rate, while the wealthiest people and the largest corporations are doing extraordinarily well. We're looking at record-breaking profits for corporations, and yet their effective tax rate is the lowest since 1972, and we have many, 1 out of 4 major corporations in this country not paying a nickel in taxes. So the issue that we have to deal with is, do we really want to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, Head Start, or do we want to ask the wealthiest people and the largest corporations to start paying their fair share of taxes? And so what I think the Murray budget is about is raising revenue. There are substantial cuts in it. Also, by the way, when real unemployment in this country is not 7.7%, but over 14%, when for young people the unemployment rate is even higher than that, we are putting about $100 billion into helping to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, our roads, bridges, water systems, to put people back to work. So the point that I would make is that while certainly we have to concentrate on deficit reduction, we also have to create millions and millions of jobs in this country and put our people back to work.
Would you vote for Senator Murray's budget plan as it stands right now? Does it go far enough for you?
It doesn't go as far as I would like. Again, I think when we have in this country the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and worse today than it has been in any time since before the Great Depression of 1929. Let me just give you just one example, if I might. Today, the top 1%, the wealthiest 1% in this country, own 38% of the wealth. Do you know what the bottom 60% own? Very few people do. 2.3%. 2.3% for the bottom 60%. Top 1% own 38% of the wealth. You got one family in this country, the Walton family of Walmart, owns more wealth than the bottom 40%. And in terms of income, what we should know is that the last study done on the subject from 2009 through 2011 showed that 100% of all of the new income that was developed in this country went to the top 1%. Bottom 99% lost. Median family income going down. So when you have that inequality, when you have the middle class shrinking, people on top, large corporations enjoying record-breaking profits, I think you've got to ask them to play a role in deficit reduction, not go after the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor.
Senator Sanders, the New York Times shows the latest Republican proposal on the table versus the Democratic proposal, and it points out that Democrats, led by Senator Murray, would like to see a tax increase, raises $975 billion in new revenues by closing loopholes that benefit corporations and the wealthy. And then also new spending is on the table as well, includes $100 billion in stimulus on job training and infrastructure. Exactly. Is that the solution, the job training and infrastructure, in your opinion?
Sure it is. Look, we have, as I've mentioned today, real unemployment, including those people who have given up looking for work and those people who are working part-time. It's over 14%. It is horrendous for people of color. For young people, the numbers are even higher. We have got to put our people back to work. Focusing on deficit reduction is very important. But creating the millions of jobs that our economy desperately needs is even more important. And I would go further than that. Everybody, I could tell you that in the state of Vermont, and I suspect that in the other 49 states, We have a serious problem with roads and bridges and water systems and schools, broadband. We need to invest in our infrastructure to make this country more productive. And when you do that, you create jobs. So I am a big fan of investing in the infrastructure, and I'm strongly supportive of that proposal. I would have gone higher on that, to tell you the truth.
The competing plans we can see here in the Wall Street Journal: Democratic plan in blue, Republican plan in red. Total spending, and then the difference in revenue. A Republican proposal does not include new revenue, but the Democratic plan does. You can see that there.
Well, but that's the real issue. Do you really think that the only way we can move to deficit reduction is cut, 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 when revenue now at 15.8% is the lowest that it has been in 60 years? I think it has to be a balanced approach, and I think we need revenue coming from closing outrageous loopholes that corporations now enjoy.
To talk with Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, in his second term now, Democrats can call 202-585-3880, Republicans 202-585-3881, and independents 202-585-3882. We've got folks already eager to talk to you, so let's go to Edward in Grand Prairie, Texas, on our Democrats line. Hi, Edward.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Go ahead, you're on with Senator Sanders.
Okay, I want to represent Senator Sanders. My concern is that you guys are being easy on the Republicans about raising tax. The Democrats not raising tax. All they're trying to do is get rid of the welfare program called subsidies. You guys don't emphasize that fact that we are subsidizing these corporations. And we talk about the 1%. We're not raising their tax. We're just trying to get them to pay their share of their taxes like every other citizen. And when we talk about corporations not paying any tax, we're saying that we're not raising their tax. We're trying to get them to pay tax like other organizations. You know, one thing in looking at the programs is that we talked about how the workers' income have decreased. The reason why it has decreased is because you have many of those red states that have voted for Republican during the Reagan administration and during the Johnson administration that killed the union, which at the time was about 35% of the citizenship. But now it's only 6%. And over that period of time, the workers have decreased while the corporations have increased. And this is, I don't understand why you guys are being nice to these Republicans.
Well, Edwin, thank you. I think my Republican colleagues would probably disagree with you as to how nice I have been to them. You make several good points. First of all, when we talk about the decline of the middle class, median family income going down, most of the new jobs being created in this country are low-wage jobs. The gap between the very wealthy and everybody else is growing. Why? There are a couple of factors involved. Number one, the decline of trade unionism is certainly one of those reasons. We used to have far greater representation, so workers could sit down and collectively negotiate a contract and get a decent wage. And we have lost millions and millions of decent union jobs. And the second issue, though, has to do with our disastrous trade policies. And that is, and I voted against all of these things, from NAFTA to permanent normal trade relations with China. What Congress, at the behest of large corporations, have done is say, we're going to open up our markets. But the real truth was that in the last 10 years or so, we have lost some 50,000 factories in this country. Many of them going to China and other low-wage countries. And that those trade policies would say to corporations, you can throw American workers out on the street, move to China, bring your products back in this country, have been disastrous for the American worker. Now, in terms of tax policy, let me just tell you this, because I've been working on this issue for a while. We are losing every year about $100 billion in revenue, because large corporations, whether it is the Bank of America, Citigroup, ExxonMobil, many of these very large corporations have stashing their profits in the Cayman Islands and other tax havens where they avoid taxes. There's just a front page story in the Wall Street Journal about that. I think it was last week. So what we have got to do is end these loopholes with these large corporations, many of whom, by the way, if they're Wall Street firms, we bailed out against my vote. Congress bailed them out when their recklessness almost destroyed the economy. They were wonderful American companies. They needed the help of the American people. But when it comes to paying taxes, they prefer to put their money in the Cayman Islands. That's an issue that has to be addressed. And right now, at 12% of profits, corporations are paying the lowest effective corporate tax rate since 1972. So this is an issue that we do have to address.
Let's listen to Senator McConnell, leader of the Republicans, talking about the Democratic budget plan. This is before it was unveiled officially, and here's his feedback on it.
Given what we've heard about the budget so far, it's obvious why they've refused to release one for so many years. We hear it won't prevent programs like Medicare from going bankrupt. We hear it contains yet more wasteful, quote, stimulus spending that turns out to be a lot more effective at generating jokes for late-night comedians than jobs. And in order to finance more spending, we hear it relies on more than $1 trillion. That's a trillion with a T in new taxes, including on the middle class. Remember, Washington Democrats already got more than $600 billion in taxes this year. So where's this new revenue going to come from? Charities? The home mortgage interest deduction? Will they go after families and small businesses yet again? At least there's one thing we almost certainly know. Their budget will never balance. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever.
Senator McConnell. Senator Sanders, what's your response?
Wow, he is wrong in every instance. The first point is actually that what we've done in the Budget Committee is have made cuts in health programs, including Medicare, but we do it without cutting benefits. And here's how we do it and why we do it. And by the way, the Budget Committee is the committee that comes up with the blueprint. It is the Finance Committee, the Appropriations Committee that go more into the details. But here's what Mr. McConnell doesn't appreciate. His friend in the House, Congressman Ryan, ends Medicare as we know it, converts it into a voucher program. And that means that if you are 65, 66, 67, government will give you an inadequate check, that's what a check, and say, go out to the private insurance companies and you get your health care. Well, if you have cancer, if you have diabetes, if you have a serious health problem, what kind of health care do you think you're going to get when you're 67 years old, when you have an inadequate check? That's their plan. And then they want to make massive cuts in Medicaid. Now, what we have said is that at a time when in the United States we are spending almost twice as much per capita on health care, this is not just Medicare, but this is all of our health care systems. And in many ways, our outcomes are not as good as other countries. Of course, we can make the health care system more efficient. One of the things you could do in Medicare is, for the first time, against Republican opposition, is demand that Medicare negotiate prescription drugs with the pharmaceutical industry. We can save very substantial sums of money, do that. Put more money into primary care so people don't have to go into an emergency room at 10 times the cost of going to a primary care physician. So there are a lot of things you can do to save money without cutting benefits. They decimate Medicare and Medicaid. Second point, he talks about stimulus. Yeah, let me be very clear. When the infrastructure of this country is collapsing, when in Vermont and all over this nation we need to put huge amounts of money into rebuilding bridges, many of which are now unsafe, our roads, our rail system, and when we can create jobs, yeah, I think that is exactly the right thing to do. And he talks about raising taxes. What we are talking about is ending loopholes. Maybe Mitch McConnell thinks it's a good idea that companies like the Bank of America can put their profits into the Cayman Islands and go through a year in 2010 where this hugely profitable corporation doesn't pay a nickel in taxes. If that's what Mitch McConnell thinks is a good public policy, I strongly disagree with him. So I think what you're seeing is a big philosophical divide. In my view, in this instance, the Republicans are standing with these large corporations. 1 out of 4 of them are not paying a nickel in taxes. And we think, hey, before you cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, we're going to ask these guys to start paying their fair share.
In that excerpt from the C-SPAN video library, Senator McConnell talked about balancing the budget, and a couple questions have come in on Twitter related to that. Sandy Beach wants to know this. He says Ryan's budget, Congressman Ryan's budget, balances in 10 years. When does your budget balance out? And then Spring Boy wants to know why deficits, quote, don't matter.
Deficits do matter. And our budget deficits do matter. And let's talk about how we got to where we are right now. Sometimes we forget about that. When Clinton left office in 2000 and Bush took over, this country had a $236 billion surplus. And then what happened in the next few years under Bush is we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you know how we paid for those wars? We didn't pay for it at all. We gave huge tax breaks to the wealthy. We didn't offset it. Passed the Medicare Part D prescription drug program, unpaid for. And because Wall Street was deregulated, and when I was in the House, I've got to tell you, Libby, I fought that very, very hard. But they got deregulated, and they came up with these complicated financial procedures which ended up bringing Wall Street to the verge of collapse, and that led to a recession, which led to less revenue coming in. That's why we are in an $850 billion deficit right now. That's the fact. So deficits do matter. And we got to get out of this deficit, but you have to do it in a balanced way, not on the backs of people who are already hurting. Now, maybe there are some viewers out there. Maybe Mitch McConnell thinks that I should cut Social Security for an elderly person living in Vermont on $15,000 a year. Ain't going to do it. And maybe Mr. McConnell thinks we should cut benefits, which he does, for disabled veterans, guys who have lost their arms and legs fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, or maybe the widow of somebody who got killed in Iraq. Cut their benefits before we have these large corporations to pay their fair share. I disagree with that. I'm not going to support that.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont. He serves on the Budget Committee. He also sits on Environment and Public Works, Energy and Natural Resources, Veterans Affairs, and then Education, Labor, and Pensions. As he said, he served in the House of Representatives 1991 until he was elected to the Senate. Let's go now to Wichita Falls, Texas. Republican Ruby joins us. Hi, Ruby.
Good morning.
Good morning. Turn down your TV for us and go ahead.
My question is...
Yes, Ruby?
If you are... Yes. May I...
What's your question?
My question is, if you're going to cut spending, why wouldn't you start with the president and his family? If I personally have problems with money and he is in charge of our country, I would start with my own spending that the government is paying for. I wouldn't be going on expensive vacations, having a separate plane that takes the pet. The spending and the working on the budget, I don't understand how a president and his family could spend the amount of money when the country is in dire need.
And Ruby, do you want to see them change, in your opinion, because of the actual savings or because of the example that they be setting?
Well, first of all, I think an example, they make good income. Let them spend their own money on vacation.
Well,
I think
we'll get Senator Sanders.
Well, I think they do spend their own money on vacations, Ruby. I think all I would ask you to consider is there are a lot of unbalanced people out there. There have been a lot of threats on the president's life, and it's important that we keep the president safe. And there's a whole lot of security that has to go into that.
Matt, Concord, New Hampshire, independent caller. Hi, Matt.
Yes, hello, Senator Sanders, and good morning, C-SPAN. I'm a disabled person. I was disabled in an industrial accident in a woodworking shop in my mid-40s, at the prime of my career. I'd worked at Strawberry Bank, Sturbridge Village, North Churchwood, Paul Revere Road from Nathaniel Hall, Boston Public Libraries. I was a windows and door expert. I worked my whole career to get there. When I took my Social Security disability, what I was eligible for on Social Security retirement was cut in half. I get Medicare. I do not take Medicaid because the state of New Hampshire is a recovery state, and they come and take your estates and all that, and I don't want to deal with it. I have a wife. I have to look out for my grandchildren. So I agreed to take half of my Social Security In my mid-40s, I was disabled. No doctor in the world can figure out what's wrong with me. I was electrocuted and survived something I should have never lived through. And every month, I have to pay a Medigap insurance on top of paying $100 out of my check for Medicare. My Medigap, I am billed as an 84-year-old, and I am now currently 55. I am billed at an 84-year-old age because no doctor can figure out what's wrong with me, so they can't really give me a straight diagnosis. I was declared an epileptic. I was undeclared an epileptic. Post-traumatic stress.
Okay, Matt, let's take your sharing of your response and go to Senator Sanders.
Well, Matt, this is what I would tell you. And, you know, it sounds like you've had a very tough situation. And what I will simply tell you is the plight that you have described. You were injured on the job. You're disabled. You can't go out and get another job. There are, I don't know, my guess is millions of people in one way or another in the same boat as you are. There are mothers out there trying to raise a family whose husband got killed, and they're trying to bring up some kids. And what America is supposed to be about, and what some of us believe has got to be about, is to making sure that we don't leave anybody behind. You can't earn a living, but you're entitled to live with dignity. If a woman loses her husband on the job and has 2 kids, she's entitled to bring up those kids with dignity. If somebody is 70 years of age and is sick, they're entitled to get the health care that they need. That is the debate, Matt, that we're having right now in Washington. And let me be very clear, the disability programs that you are enjoying right now, which I'm hearing from you think are inadequate, they will be cut substantially by Republicans. Because if you don't bring in revenue and you want to move very rapidly to deficit reduction, that's all that they can do. So Medicare would no longer be the program that it is. No debate about this. What older people would be forced to do is get a check, try to find a doctor. Now, what doctor, what hospital is going to take you in if you're dealing with cancer and you don't have a whole lot of money? It's going to come out of your own pocket, or you're not going to get the health care that you need. If today you're on Medicaid and you lose that, and the Republican plan would throw millions of people off of Medicaid, what do you do if you are a mom with a kid who is sick and you don't have a lot of money? What happens to you? Well, Republicans don't bother to think about that. That's not their issue. So I think what you are talking about, the story that you have just told, is a story reflected in millions of families. And if we stand together as a nation and we say we're going to take care of everybody, provide everybody with at least a minimum standard of living, or we evolve into the society where a few people on top have it all, the middle class shrinks and people down below are left to scramble for themselves. That's not the America that I believe in.
We have the latest numbers on unemployment benefits from the Associated Press. Here's the story. Fewer Americans sought unemployment aid last week, reducing the average number of weekly applicants last month to a 5-year low. The drop shows that fewer layoffs are strengthening the job market. The Labor Department says applications fell by 10,000 to a seasonally adjusted 332,000.
Well, that's great news. And the truth is, if we remember, and I know sometimes we as Americans have short memories, if we remember 5 years ago, after the Wall Street disaster, we were losing 700,000 jobs a month. Now we have gained a few 100,000 jobs. Unemployment is going down. And that is struggling, clawing our way out of this terrible recession. But, let me reiterate, the numbers, unemployment numbers that people talk about are not real unemployment. If you count people who have given up looking for work, somebody calls you up and says, are you looking for work? No, there's no work here. Or you're working 20 hours when you want to work 40 hours. You add that together, we're over 14%. So are we making some progress in rebuilding the economy? Yes, we are. Do we have a long way to go? We sure do.
Loretta, Cleveland, Ohio, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Senator Sanders, I have a cold, so excuse me. But I don't ever want you to think, sir, that you are not appreciated. I'm going to tell you right now that I am absolutely behind you 100%. I agree with your views. And I'm just wondering how come they don't tie the debt and the sequester to the wealth gap. It looks like to me that we work and we get paid twice a month. But I'm thinking about how many checks these fat cats are getting. They're getting a check from offshore banking. They're getting a check from carried interest. They're getting a check from the tax cuts, a check from the loopholes, a check from corporate subsidies, and that's on top of if they filing personal, because the Supreme Court made corporations people too. So, sir, I don't get all of that. And I'm wondering what's wrong with Mr. Ryan, where he's looking at little people who are getting one check from a job and 5 and 6 checks for these corporations and the 1%. So, and how much money is offshore in total? They've been doing this for over 50 years.
Okay, Loretta, we'll get a response from Senator Sanders.
Well, I think Loretta raises a lot of issues. And Loretta, let me give you the simple answer. The bottom line here is, and I will tell you what very few senators and members of the House tell the American people, is that big money interests, to a very, very significant degree, control what goes on in Washington. I think at this point, as the Republican Party has moved from being what we call a center-right party, kind of a moderate conservative party, to a right-wing extremist party, they control that party very, very significantly. And that's what the Ryan budget is about. What the Ryan budget is about is saying, yeah, at a time when the middle class is disappearing and so many people are hurting, we're going to cut programs for people who are hurting and give more tax breaks for the wealthiest people. But what I also have to tell you, Loretta, as an independent, as the longest-serving independent in American history, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, the Democrats are just great. They're fighting day and night for working families. That is not the case. They're also influenced by big money interests. Now, what has happened in recent years to make a bad situation worse in terms of the power of money over the political process, and we have this horrendous 5-4 Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And what that decision has said is that if you are a billionaire who want more tax breaks for the rich, if you are a corporate leader who wants to make it even easier to send jobs to China, why, you can now put as much money as you want into the political process. You can put tens and tens of millions of dollars in ugly TV ads on the air, radio ads, and whatnot. So that has given even more power to big money. It has made the average senator or member of Congress even more fearful about standing up to Wall Street or the big energy companies, and it has made a bad situation worse. Now, in terms of offshore, you raised that issue. It is a very important issue. You know, most Americans work and they pay their taxes. What the large corporations do is set up subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, other tax havens in order to avoid taxes. And what really gets to me, it's really quite funny. You remember 5 years ago when Wall Street was on the verge of collapse, they went begging to the President of the United States Congress, and they said, oh, bail us out, bail us out. We need hundreds of billions of dollars. We're good American companies, bail us out. I voted against that bailout, but they got it, $750 billion. But when it comes to paying taxes, they're not quite so patriotic. They don't quite love America. They prefer to raise the retirement age to 70 to pay their fair share, stashing their money in the Cayman Islands and avoiding American taxes. We've got legislation in, by the way, Loretta, that would deal with just that issue and end those outrageous corporate loopholes.
Our guest, Senator Sanders, announced yesterday that he's introduced a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United ruling. Here's a story from Legal Newsline. The amendment would overturn the 2010 Supreme Court ruling that allowed unrestricted campaign spending by corporations. Who are you getting support from on this?
Well, we're working with Congressman Ted Deutsch from Florida in the House, so it's being introduced in the House and the Senate. What we are seeing is all over this country, hundreds of cities, I think we're up to 9 states that have gone on record, is making it very clear that they think that Citizens United is an obscenity, that corporations are not people. I mean, I don't know how many Americans think that corporations are people. I haven't met too many who believe that ExxonMobil, good old ExxonMobil, is just like you and me. No one believes that. And that we have got to give power back to Congress and the states to regulate campaign finance. We cannot have billionaires buying elections. That is not what American democracy is supposed to be about.
Let's hear from Lorraine, San Diego independent caller. Good morning.
Good morning. Senator Sanders, I'm very concerned that the president does not uphold democratic principles, primarily with regard to Social Security. I understand, I've read that he is willing to put the chain CPI on the table in his budget discussions with Republicans in order to achieve the grand bargain. And I understand this issue was discussed in the meeting he had with a group of Democrats either yesterday or day before. And I read that you approached him about this, but I'd like you to discuss it more in depth. I would really like to understand why he feels that he has to betray Americans and Democrats in particular with his support of this program. He doesn't seem to be communicating and cooperating well with Democrats in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate.
Well, Lorraine, I wish I could say that what you said was not factually correct, but it was exactly factually correct. You're exactly right. This is an issue that I have been working on with a number of other senators and members of the House for quite some time now. Let me explain what the so-called chain CPI is. Now, if you're a senior citizen, you're going to start laughing when I tell you this, but this is what people believe. Right now, the government has to calculate what inflation is every year. So we make adjustments, cost of living adjustments for seniors, for disabled veterans, other people receiving government programs. And if you take a minute, you can realize that's pretty hard to do. What an 18-year-old kid spends is different than what an 85-year-old person who is suffering with cancer will spend. In any case, there are some right-wing folks who came up with the theory that the COLAs that we're giving to seniors and disabled veterans have been too generous, and we have got to reconfigure how we determine those COLAs with the goal of cutting them back. If the chain CPI, this is the new configuration, were to go into effect, if you are 65 today, by the time you're 75, you'd get $650 a year less. By the time you're 85, you get $1,000 a year less. If you are a disabled veteran today, say you got injured in Iraq, you're 30 years of age, by the time you're 65, you'll be getting thousands of dollars a year less in your benefits as a result of the new configuration. Now, Lorraine asked, why did the president come up with this idea? I've talked to him about this on several occasions. I think he is dead wrong. And I and others are doing our best to try to get him to rethink this position. The truth of the matter is the president has been quite good in funding the Veterans Administration. We've seen some significant increases there, and I speak now as the chairman of the Committee on Veterans Affairs in the Senate. And I don't know why he would be thinking about cutting back benefits on disabled vets. So we're going to work with him on this. But I do want to say it is not just the president. Mitch McConnell and all of the Republicans are fighting for this chain CPI. They would rather save money by cutting benefits on disabled vets and for people on Social Security rather than ask large corporations who are now paying zero in taxes to pay something.
Jim on Twitter wants to know if you felt the same way you do about corporations when unions could contribute millions, and he writes, others were denied.
I'm sorry, when?
Do you feel the same way you do about corporations?
Yeah.
Do you feel the same way about unions? And Jim writes, you used to be able to contribute millions and others were denied.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. No, what I am saying is it's not just billionaires. No entity, not you, not me, not unions, not Wall Street, should be able to buy elections. Absolutely.
Kalamazoo, Michigan. Paul, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Mr. Sanders, the wealthy people for the last 40 years have been not spending as much or paying as much taxes as they should. I would suggest that perhaps it's time to recover some of that past, and an annual tax on income that's never going to do it. perhaps it's time to set up a net worth tax, a very strong and progressive one. Would like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, Paul, we have looked at that. I think what Paul is talking about is a tax on wealth, which I believe does exist in some countries. It's something worth examining. I think there are people who would say that there are constitutional issues involved. But Paul raises a very profound question, which the media does not talk about very much, and certainly is not talked about in the halls of Congress. And that is the danger that in our country today, and again, I don't know how many members of Congress will tell you this, the real danger that we have is that we're losing not only the middle class of this country, not only our democratic traditions through Citizens United, etc., but this country is rapidly on its way into an oligarchic form of government where a handful of very powerful entities and families control the economic and political life of this country. When you have, as I mentioned earlier, a situation where 1% of the families in America own 38% of the wealth, and the bottom 60% own 2.3% of the wealth, and that gap between the very, very, very rich, I'm not just talking about the rich, I'm talking about the really rich, and everybody else is growing wider. And when these people can buy elections, when these people can avoid paying taxes by putting their money in tax havens, when these people can ship jobs to China and other low-wage countries, we've got a real problem in this country. And what we need is a very strong grassroots political movement that basically says, you know what, the United States government has got to start working for all of us and not just for the handful of people who make the campaign contributions.
One of our tweeters wants to see more Sanders filibusters. He says, don't let Rand Paul have the last word. Tell us about your experience engaging in your own filibuster, and would you do it again, something like entitlement reform?
Well, the answer is at the proper time and for the proper cause, I would. I would prefer not to do it alone. I would prefer to bring forth a group of people. There's some very fine members of the Senate who I think agree with me on many issues. I think the issue here that we have got to be talking about is that in America, with the middle class in so much pain, with unemployment so high, with the gap between the very wealthy and everybody else, whose side should government be on? Do you stand with working families even if they cannot contribute $100 million into a campaign? Well, I think you do. So I think what a number of us have got to be focusing on in terms of tax reform, in terms of protecting and expanding health care. Let me just give you one example. Many viewers may not know this. We argue about Medicare and we argue about Medicaid. Today, the United States is the only major country in the industrialized world that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right. I think as a result of the Affordable Care Act, we're going to bring more people into health care. That's good. I supported that. We're going to have more primary health care. But we need to make health care as a right for all people. And yet today we're spending almost twice as much as any other country on health care. What do we do about it? How do you create a health care system that is stronger, that protects all of our people? How do you create the millions of jobs that we desperately need? How do you deal with Wall Street? Wall Street right now, let me just make one point here. I know I've made a number of points. Let me make one, which I think is important. We bailed out Wall Street because they were too big to fail. I'm sure all of the viewers will be delighted to know that every single one of these major Wall Street institutions, Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, is today far larger than they were before we bailed them out. And in fact, you have the top 6 Wall Street institutions that have assets equivalent to 2/3 of the GDP of the United States of America. Do people think that's healthy for our economy? I don't. I think you got to break these guys up. But that's where we are today. Story from Politico 3 years ago. Bernie Sanders' last stand writes about your filibuster of 8 hours on the Senate floor. And it's a long time. I know it's Mr. Paul went on longer, but it is a long time. And I think, let me just, again, the idea of a filibuster is something that I support. I disagree very strongly with Rand Paul. He has the right to filibuster. This is what I don't agree with. I believe that we have to end this absurdity in the Senate where the Republicans are now demanding 60 votes on almost, not every, important piece of legislation. So point being is if somebody wants to get up and make their point, whether it's Rand Paul, Bernie Sanders, or anybody else, they should have that right. Want to go on for 2 days, do it. But at the end of that period, you know what? 51 votes should prevail, not 60.
Last call is Austin in Winter Haven, Florida, Republican. Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for C-SPAN, and thank you, Senator Sanders, for being on here. I just wanted to make 2 points. You spoke of the Cayman Islands and cutting prices for the Cayman Island for people to keep their money in the Caymans, and I'm just wondering, why is it the smart play for us to keep our money, or for people to keep their money in the Cayman Islands when they are, that's the smart play. We're 15th in the world for the best place to keep your money. And I'd also like to mention with the roads and the bridges, we already pay 35.9 cents per gallon for building roads and bridges. Why do we need to add more money into building more roads and bridges?
Okay, let me answer the questions from Austin, Texas. Number one, taxes in the Cayman Islands are 0. That's why. In fact, the effective corporate tax rate today is 12%. The nominal is 35%, but very few people pay that. Very few corporations pay that. It's 12%. And the percentage of revenue that corporations are now contributing into the federal government as part of GDP has gone down, way, way down from where it was before. So I guess if you're a large bank, yeah, 0 is better than paying anything in the United States. That's why they are doing that. So that would be my answer to that question. And I just think that that's wrong. We are a nation, and it is wrong for some of the wealthiest and most powerful entities, especially in the middle of a serious deficit situation, to say, hey, I don't want to pay any taxes in the United States. I'm putting my money in the Cayman Islands.
Senator Bernie Sanders, among the committees he sits on, budget. He's also the chairman of Veterans Affairs, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, among others. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.